Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter. I'll be your host for today's show. Today we're going to talk about what are current topics of interest being discussed in compensation committees. And joining me for this discussion is Virginia Rhodes, who's the lead consultant with Meridian Compensation Partners. Welcome, Virginia.
Thanks, TK. Thanks for having me.
So how about if we just do first sort of a total landscape type thing on what are you seeing as far as issues evolve over the last 12 months?
Right. Well, dare I say, TK, it's one of the more interesting times in the world of executive compensation. Now, full transparency, I may have said that before, but this time I really mean it. And what I mean by that is the discussions are changing, the conversations are evolving. You know, we spent so many years worrying about compliance. We wanted to make sure we were in compliance with 162M regulations. We wanted to be sure that our plans and programs were described in our proxy so that we checked certain boxes for proxy advisors. We wanted to make sure that we were setting goals appropriately. Well, now the conversations have moved beyond that. And it's about broader topics. And it's really about corporations stepping back and trying to understand what is their true purpose, and then how does that change the landscape of how they're paying their executives. So you may recall that the Business Roundtable put out a statement recently about the purpose of a corporation. 181 CEOs signed their names to this commitment, and in that they listed 5 key stakeholders, not just one, but 5. The first on that list, and maybe I'm reading a little more into the order of how they prioritize their stakeholders, but the first one on that list was customers. The 5th one, the last one on that list, was shareholders. And everywhere in between, they had employers, they had suppliers, they had the community within which they work. So all of these conversations are now finding their way into the boardroom, and companies are stepping back to say, what does that mean from a pay perspective? You know, for years it was all about including EPS metrics into your goal setting, including total shareholder return as a long-term metric. Now companies are talking about, should diversity and inclusion be included in there? Are there other ESG topics that we should be talking about? So in the compensation committee in particular, the conversations are around human capital management practices and policies, and things that 10 years ago we weren't even talking about in the boardroom. That was really HR's purview. Now the committee is stepping in and wanting to understand more about how these programs work. So we've really seen an evolution in terms of what's being discussed. The other thing we're discovering is that even the definition of what long-term is changing. So the Council of Institutional Investors has come out and said that long-term programs, where currently they're based on a myriad of portfolio vehicles, you might have stock options, you might have restricted shares and performance plans. Should we be simplifying? Should we be taking a step back and saying what's truly important, and what should we be tying our executive programs to? Should it just be equity? Should there be no more performance measures included? Now that may be one step too far, but it's an interesting conversation to have at the committee level. The other thing that we found is that the definition of long-term is in flux. You know, you look at 90+% of companies out there, and if you look at their long-term incentive programs, they would define long-term as 3 years. Well, I think investors might define it a little bit differently. So companies are having to take a step back and really think about how can we incent our executive team really for the longer term, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
So quite a different conversation that we're having these days.
Well, and it's not going to stop when you think about how compensation moved away from discretion, giving the compensation committee any discretion.
Yeah.
And you look at the topics that you just went over, a lot of them don't have clear measurables.
That's
okay?
correct. Right.
So all of a sudden, you're going to be reintroducing discretion into this, which had been a no-no, but is swinging back, the pendulum swinging back in that direction.
That's
so
right.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
So why don't you touch on some of these topics that are being discussed in the boardroom, and then while you're discussing those, why don't you offer, you know, some tips to compensation committees on how they might address some of these topics?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the one that you just mentioned, discretion. It used to be a four-letter word in the committee room, and it was something that most committees shied away from, and partly because of 162M and some of the requirements there, but probably even more so because of their general discomfort with using discretion when it came to particularly executive pay programs. Many committees didn't want to have that flexibility. They thought that assuming their goal-setting process was rigorous enough that the plan should pay for themselves and that there really shouldn't be a reason to step in. Well, what we saw over time was that organizations were using a lot of adjustments in their financials, trying to get at what a true level of performance really looked like, and committees were having to take a step back and say, were we performing at a level that generated this type of payout, or should there be some sort of adjustment that we should take into consideration? So we have found that over the last, call it 12 to 18 months, organizations are becoming more, are allowing discretion to be more of a topic in the committee discussions, because they're now realizing that there are other metrics that aren't as formulaic, that are more strategic in nature, that are critical to the success of the organization. You know, I mentioned those 4 or 5 different stakeholders that organizations are realizing that they're really trying to appease, and many of those have measures that don't lend themselves to bottom line financials. You know, let's talk about employee engagement. Let's talk about supplier diversity. All of these items are ones that are critically important to the success of organizations, but are quite difficult to measure, particularly over a long term. So companies are finding that some of these measures are, you know, the devil's in the details, trying to figure out how are we going to put those into our incentive programs, and is that the right place to put them? You know, let's talk about ESG, the topic that everybody wants to discuss, from investors to broader stakeholders. And it has been very interesting to hear from the committee's perspective how to break down ESG into the various components, and which one of those components are measurable and which ones aren't. You know, you look at the energy companies, they've taken greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and many of them have put that into their incentive programs. Some of the CPG companies are now looking at ways to incorporate sustainability into their executive plans. But these things are very difficult to measure. And again, over which period are we measuring? You know, many of the energy companies have stakes in the ground to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the next 20 to 30 years. Well, that's quite long term. So we'll see if we can get there from a comp program design perspective. But my fear is that we'll have to take baby steps, right? So metrics are certainly something that committees are now talking a lot more about in a much broader sense than they used to. You know, I mentioned diversity and inclusion. That's been a big one lately, not just at the board level. You know, boardroom diversity has certainly gotten a lot of press, but broader down in the organization. And committees are asking questions of management. You know, what does your pipeline look like from a recruiting standpoint? How are you making sure that your talent pool is diverse enough at every level of the organization? So many of these topics are ones that HR has struggled with for decades, but they are just now bubbling up to the level of the board, because the board is now realizing that there's a lot of risk associated with not doing these things well. Succession planning is another big one that's finding its way on comp committee agendas in particular. Succession planning is a topic that boards have been struggling with for years, and usually focused on the C-suite level. Now what we're finding is at the comp committee level, they're going down a step or two below that. And the reason for that is that they want to make sure that when they have a succession plan that comes into play, that they're not meeting their new CFO for the first time when he or she takes over that role. That they've identified this individual early on, that they've understood the gap analysis that's been conducted and what's being done from a career management perspective, so that they know and that they can feel comfortable with the fact that there are levels of leadership below the C-suite that will then step into those roles fairly easily. The third is probably company culture. And this is one that, as we know and we've read about in the news, unfortunately has a lot of risk inherent in it. But the real question is, how does a board of an organization understand company culture? Because they're not walking the halls daily, they're not on site frequently enough oftentimes to really understand what company culture feels like. So it's incumbent upon management to bring forth snippets throughout the year so they can educate the board on what the company culture of that organization looks like. one of the tools that we've seen work well at the committee level is for management to come forth with what we call an HCM dashboard, Human Capital Management Dashboard. And what that is it takes each of these topic areas and provides a baseline for the comp committee to really understand and recognize and then prioritize which areas they find the most interesting and potentially the most vulnerable for the organization. So let's say you've got a bucket around demographics, you've got a bucket around exit interview statistics, you've got a bucket around high potential employees, there might be an employee engagement result bucket, and providing that baseline to the committee so that then they can take a step back and say, okay, let's dive a little bit more deeply on this exit interview piece. What are we hearing from folks, particularly at a senior leadership level that are being exited out of the organization? I had a client recently that provided the comp committee with verbatim, word for word quotes from Glassdoor entries, which was quite enlightening from their perspective. So, all of these things are management trying to find a way to educate the committee on what's really going on at the company from an HR perspective.
Well, I almost feel, Virginia, like we're going to end up in a vicious cycle with investors, because they wanted everything to be measurable.
Yep.
Now we're moving into a big discretion that's going to give the committee a lot of leeway. I suspect, if I had to guess, I suspect that then they're going to be unhappy with some of the discretion that happens, and then we're going to see another move.
Another shift.
I understand that must be challenging from both the committee and a consultant's perspective.
Yeah.
So
it is about threading that needle, because I do think you're right. I think if the pendulum shifts too far, you're going to have disconnects with pay and performance, but yet there still is the appetite, and it's coming from investors, frankly, of this energy around those more strategic topics that may not lend themselves to kind of the financial quantitative measurement.
Well, we'll have to keep a close eye on what's happening during this season when all these plans are confirmed.
Yep.
And we'll have to bring Meridian back and find out what the result of all this was.
Look forward to it.
I want to thank you for taking the time to join us.
Yeah.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week to take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.